Walt Disney, the living legend of the American dream, died like a wounded animal, his lungs shattered, his body exhausted, his mind in turmoil and confusion. His final act was not to embrace his family. Instead, he wrote a stranger's name on a piece of paper: Kurt Russell. He was neither a brilliant producer nor a worthy heir. He was only a child. That piece of paper was a slap in the face to the entire entertainment industry. In his final moments, St. Walt proved that behind Disney's glamour wasn't magic, but utter chaos. He departed, leaving behind a joke that would send shivers down Hollywood's spine for 50 years to come. Born on March 17, 1951, in Springfield, Massachusetts, Kurt Vogel Russell was, at that moment, 15 years old. He had a dimpled chin, bright blue eyes, and a smile that seemed to have been manufactured in a factory specifically to sell breakfast cereal. He was not in the hospital room. He was likely thinking about baseball. He was thinking about his batting average. He was thinking about the distinct, satisfying crack of a wooden bat hitting a leather ball. He was thinking about anything other than the dead man in Burbank. When the news of the note reached him, it didn't feel like a blessing. It didn't feel like winning a lottery. It felt like a door slamming shut and locking from the outside. The media spun it instantly. They loved a fairy tale. The last discovery of Walt Disney. The son Walt never had. It was a perfect headline, a sentimental balm for a grieving public. They portrayed it as a torch being passed from the old master to the young prodigy. They were wrong. It wasn't a torch, it was a leash. By writing that name, Walt Disney hadn't given Kurt Russell a gift. He had drafted him. He had conscripted a teenage boy into a war for the soul of American culture. Kurt was no longer just a kid from the suburbs. He was now a living monument, a breathing statue tasked with preserving an era of innocence that was already dead and rotting. The timing could not have been more violent. It was late 1966. The world outside the Disney studio gates was beginning to tear itself apart. The illusion of the 1950s, the white picket fences, the nuclear families, the moral clarity of World War II was dissolving in acid. The Vietnam War was escalating. Every night, the evening news broadcast images of body bags and burning villages into American living rooms. Young men Kurt's age were not wishing upon stars. They were burning their draft cards. They were growing their hair long. They were dropping acid in San Francisco. They were questioning everything. America was screaming. But inside the Walt Disney Studios, silence was mandatory. The dress code was absolute. Men wore suits, women wore skirts, facial hair was forbidden. The studio was a hermetically sealed bubble, a desperate attempt to freeze time in 1955. They were selling a version of America that no longer existed, and they needed a face to sell it. They needed a face that said, everything is okay. A face that said, ignore the riots. A face that said, trust authority. They looked at Kurt Russell, and they saw that face. Kurt didn't want the job. This is the crucial hidden gear in the machine of his life. He didn't hunger for fame. He didn't pine for the applause. Most child stars are pushed by ambitious mothers or driven by a desperate need for validation. Kurt was different. He viewed acting with the detached pragmatism of a plumber fixing a leaky pipe. This attitude came from his father. Bing Russell was a man of the earth, a former professional baseball player turned character actor. Bing appeared in hundreds of episodes of television, usually playing the sheriff, the deputy, or the guy who gets shot in the second act of a Western. For Bing, acting wasn't art. It wasn't a mystical journey into the soul. It was a trade. It was a way to put steaks in the freezer and pay the mortgage. Bing taught his son the code of the blue-collar actor. You show up on time. You know your lines. You hit your mark. You don't complain. You take the check and you go home. Fame is a byproduct, not the goal. The goal is survival. Kurt absorbed this. He started acting not because he had a burning passion, but because it was the family business. It was what Russell's did. His first brush with the absurdity of stardom came early, and it involved the king of rock and roll. At age 11, Kurt made his film debut in It Happened at the World's Fair. His role was uncredited and physically painful. He was the kid paid to kick Elvis Presley in the shins. Kurt didn't care about Elvis. To him, Elvis was just the guy in the jumpsuit. Kurt was more interested in the paycheck. He walked onto the set, delivered a swift kick to the shin of the most famous man on the planet, took his money, and went back to school. He wore a pad on his shoe to protect his foot. Elvis wore a pad on his leg to protect the royal shin. It was a transaction, nothing more. But the Disney executives saw something in that brief moment. They saw a lack of fear. They saw a boy who wasn't intimidated by the lights. When Walt Disney first met Kurt, he didn't see an actor. He saw a mirror. He saw the Midwestern ideal he had spent his life cultivating. Walt was tired. He was sick. He was looking for immortality, not in a cryogenic chamber, but in a successor who could carry the brand. He courted the boy. He gave him a tour of the studio. He spoke to him not as a child, but as an equal. He asked Kurt what he thought of different projects. He showed him unfinished sketches. It was a seduction, subtle and absolute. Kurt, young and impressionable, was flattered. Who wouldn't be? The wizard was inviting him behind the curtain, but he didn't see the strings being attached to his limbs. Then came the contract, the 10-year contract. In the entertainment industry, a decade is an eternity. It is a lifetime. To sign a 10-year contract at the age of 15 is to sign away your adolescence, your young adulthood, and your right to self-determination. Kurt signed, or rather his parents signed, and he agreed. The money was good. The security was unheard of. In the volatile life of an actor family, a 10-year guarantee was a golden ticket. But the cost was immediate. The studio began the process of sanding him down. He was no longer just Kurt Russell, the boy who liked baseball and got into scraps in the schoolyard. He was the Disney boy. The PR machine roared to life, erasing the real Kurt Russell. Interviews were scripted, photo shoots were staged. The studio manufactured a specific smile for him, open, non-threatening, and sexless. He was no longer a boy. He was a canvas upon which American parents could project their anxieties. While his peers were discovering the Doors and Jimi Hendrix, Kurt was on a soundstage in Burbank, pretending to talk to a duck. While the streets of Detroit and Newark burned in race riots, Kurt was filming The Horse in the gray flannel suit, a movie about the devastatingly low stakes of corporate advertising and equestrian sports. The cognitive dissonance began to fracture his mind. He was living two lives. By day, he was the Prince of Burbank, the crown jewel of a studio desperate to prove it was still relevant. He was pampered, protected, and watched. Handlers followed his every move. They monitored his hair length with calipers. They checked his skin for blemishes. They ensured he didn't say anything controversial about the war or civil rights. By night, he was a teenager in Los Angeles in the late 60s. He could hear the music coming from the Sunset Strip. He could feel the electricity of the counterculture vibrating in the air. He wanted to be part of it. He wanted to be dangerous. He wanted to be real, but he was contractually obligated to be fake. The burden of the note sat on him like a physical weight. Everyone at the studio knew about it. The executives looked at him with a mix of reverence and desperation. Walt chose him, they whispered. If he fails, Walt fails. If he fails, we all lose our jobs. They treated him like a holy relic. They analyzed his box office receipts like priests reading entrails. Follow Me, Boys was released in late 1966. It was a success. The executives exhaled. The boy worked. The one and only, genuine original family band. The computer wore tennis shoes. The barefoot executive. The titles alone were an insult to the changing cinema landscape. While Dustin Hoffman was revolutionizing acting in The Graduate, playing a disaffected youth alienated by the older generation, Kurt was playing a college student who accidentally absorbs the knowledge of a computer and helps a gambler win money. It was anesthetized entertainment. It was cinema, as a tranquilizer dart, and Kurt knew it. He wasn't stupid. He watched films like Easy Rider and Midnight Cowboy. He saw what cinema could be, gritty, raw, painful, honest. He looked at his own scripts filled with pratfalls and chimpanzees, and he felt a rising tide of bile. He was becoming a joke to his own generation. To the cool kids, Kurt Russell was a square. He was a narc. He was the guy you didn't invite to the party because he might tell his dad. He tried to rebel in small ways. He bought a car. He started chewing tobacco. He hung out with the stuntmen, the roughnecks of the industry who didn't care about his image. He found solace in their company because they didn't treat him like a prince. They treated him like a guy who needed to hit his mark or get run over. But the studio clamped down. They needed him pure. They needed him to be the antidote to the poison of the 60s. The tension came to a head in the early 70s. Kurt was entering his 20s. The boy was becoming a man physically, but the roles didn't change. He was still playing the wide-eyed innocent. The disconnect between his face and his soul was becoming visible on screen. If you look closely at the films from this era, behind the dazzling blue eyes, there is a flatness, a glazing over. It is the look of a prisoner counting the days until parole. He began to look for an escape route, any escape route. He looked at his father, Bing. He looked at the baseball diamond. Baseball wasn't just a sport to Kurt, it was an alternate reality. On the field, nobody cared about Walt Disney. A fastball coming at your head at 90 miles per hour doesn't care about your box office gross. The umpire doesn't care if you're the all-American boy. If you strike out, you sit down. The purity of that binary outcome, success or failure, based solely on merit, became an obsession. He started training in secret. He started hitting the cages after 12-hour days on the set. His hands, softened by makeup artists and wardrobe assistants, began to develop calluses. He was plotting a prison break. But leaving Disney wasn't like quitting a normal job. You don't just hand in your 2 weeks' notice to a dead man. The entire studio economy relied on him. He was the anchor. If he left, the terrifying thought was that the whole post-Walt era would collapse into dust. He didn't care. The suffocation was becoming lethal. He felt like he was drowning in syrup. In 1971, he made the decision. He walked into the executive offices. The air conditioning was humming. The portraits of Mickey and Donald smiled down from the walls, frozen in their eternal manic happiness. He told them he was leaving. The shock was absolute. They offered him more money. They offered him better trailers. They offered him producing credits. They appealed to his loyalty. Walt chose you, Kurt. You can't let him down. Kurt looked at them. He looked at the men in suits who had been feeding off the carcass of a genius for 7 years, using a teenage boy as their shield. I'm going to play ball, he said. It was an act of insanity. No actor in their right mind walks away from a guaranteed stardom to ride a bus in the minor leagues for $500 a month. But Kurt wasn't looking for money. He was looking for his soul. He was looking for the version of Kurt Russell that had died the day Walt wrote his name on that piece of paper. He packed his bags. He left the keys to the kingdom on the desk. He walked out of the studio gates, past the security guards who had watched him grow up and into the blinding light of the real world. He thought he was free. He thought the curse was broken. He was wrong. The ghost of Walt Disney has a long reach, and fate was waiting for him in the batter's box, holding a weapon far more dangerous than a contract. The transition from the manicured lawns of Burbank to the dusty infields of the Northwest League was not a gradual fade. It was a violent cut. One day, Kurt Russell was the pampered heir to a billion-dollar kingdom, surrounded by handlers who panicked if he sneezed. The next, he was sitting on a vinyl seat in a bus that smelled of diesel fumes, stale sweat, and wintergreen ointment, rattling down a 2-lane highway in Oregon. He was 22 years old. He had traded a limousine for a bench seat, a personal trailer for a shared room at a roadside motel, and a 6-figure contract for a monthly salary of $500. To the outside observer, this looked like madness. To the executives back at Disney, it looked like a temporary tantrum, a rebellious phase that would burn out as soon as the boy missed his first room service meal. They didn't understand the nature of the cage they had built. They didn't realize that the luxury was the bars. For Kurt, the minor leagues were not a step down. They were an elevation to reality. He played for the Bend Rainbows, a Class A affiliate of the California Angels. The stadiums were small, often just wooden bleachers surrounding a patch of grass that struggled to survive the summer heat. The lights were dim, casting long, strange shadows across the outfield. The fans weren't tourists or autograph seekers. They were locals, farmers, truck drivers, people who came to the park to drink beer and heckle the players. They didn't care about the computer-wore tennis shoes. When Kurt stepped up to the plate, nobody applauded his box office gross. If he swung and missed, they booed. They screamed that he was a bum. They called him names that would have turned the ears of the Disney censors red. And Kurt loved it. He drank in the hostility like it was fine wine. For the first time in his life, the reaction of the world was honest. If he failed, he was punished. If he succeeded, he earned it. There were no editors to cut around his mistakes, no multiple takes to get the scene right. Baseball was performed live, in the dirt, without a safety net. He wasn't just a celebrity mascot for the team. He was a prospect, a real one. He played second base with a frenetic, reckless energy. He had soft hands and a quick bat. In his first season, he hit .285. In El Paso, playing for the Sun Kings in the Texas League, he was tearing up the league, hitting over .500 before the injury struck. These weren't the stats of a dilettante. They were the numbers of a man who had a legitimate shot at the majors. The scouts began to circle. They stopped looking at him as being Russell's kid or the Disney boy. They started looking at his bat speed. They started writing notes about his footwork around the bag. For Kurt, these years were a baptism. He shed the skin of the child star. He stopped shaving every day. He let his hair grow a little longer, unkempt under the cap. He learned to chew tobacco, a habit that horrified his mother but endeared him to the roughnecks in the dugout. He learned the language of men who lived paycheck to paycheck, men who were fighting for their livelihoods every single night. The nights were long. The bus rides stretched into eternity, crossing the vast, empty landscapes of the American West. While his teammates slept or played cards, Kurt would stare out the window at the passing telephone poles. He felt a profound sense of peace. The pressure to be the all-American boy dissolved in the anonymity of the team. He was just Russell. He thought he had finally outrun the script. But destiny was waiting for him at second base, holding a weapon far more dangerous than a contract. It happened in 1973, a game like any other. The sun was hot. The dust was thick in the air. Kurt was covering second base. A runner was coming from first, desperate to break up the double play. This is a standard piece of violence in baseball, the collision at the bag. The runner slides hard, spikes high, aiming not for the base but for the fielder's legs. The fielder has to pivot, throw, and jump all in a fraction of a second. Kurt took the feed. He planted his foot. He turned to throw. The runner came in like a freight train. The collision was awkward. Kurt didn't get out of the way in time. He went down hard, his arm wrenching in a direction nature never intended. There was a sound. It wasn't loud. A wet, dull pop, like a heavy rubber band snapping deep inside a piece of meat. Adrenaline masked the immediate horror. Kurt scrambled up, shaking his arm, trying to clear the cobwebs. He finished the game. He was a Russell, after all. You don't walk off the field unless a bone is sticking out through the skin. But the next morning, the reality set in. He couldn't lift his arm. The pain was a sharp, hot needle buried in his shoulder joint. It wasn't just a bruise. It wasn't just a sprain. The diagnosis was a rotator cuff tear. The doctor was blunt. He didn't sugarcoat it. He didn't care that this was the Disney kid. He looked at the x-rays and told Kurt that he would never throw a baseball with professional velocity again. The silence in that doctor's office was heavier than anything Kurt had experienced in a hospital room in 1966. This was the death of the dream. The escape tunnel had collapsed. He tried to fight it. He spent weeks in denial. He went to the park, trying to throw, trying to change his mechanics, trying to will the muscle to reattach itself through sheer stubbornness. But every time he threw, the pain dropped him to his knees. The ball, which used to explode out of his hand, now floated harmlessly across the infield. He was 23 years old. He had no college degree. He had no other skills. He had spent his entire youth on a soundstage or a baseball diamond. He was broke. The minor league salary barely covered his rent and food. He had a family to think about. The realization was a cold, humiliating wave. He had to go back. He had to go back to the factory. He had to go back to the makeup chair. He had to go back to the fake smiles and the scripted lines. He had to go back to the prison he had publicly walked out of. The return to Hollywood in the mid-70s was a walk of shame. The industry has a long memory and it loves to see arrogance punished. Kurt had rejected them. He had said he was too good for their make-believe world. Now, here he was, hat in hand, looking for a job. The executives didn't roll out the red carpet this time. There were no 10-year contracts waiting for him. There was no grooming for succession. He was just another out-of-work actor and a has-been at 24. This period of his life, the mid to late 1970s, is often skipped over in biographies, but it is the crucible that forged the Kurt Russell we know today. It was a time of grinding, mercenary work. The joy was gone. The innocence was dead, killed by a torn tendon in a dusty infield. He didn't act because he wanted to create art. He acted because he needed to eat. He took whatever was offered. He appeared in television shows like Police Story, Hawaii Five-0, and Harry O. He played bad guys. He played victims. He played the generic handsome love interest. But something had changed in his eyes. The Disney sparkle was replaced by a hard, cynical glint. He wasn't trying to please the audience anymore. He was doing a job. He treated the camera with a new kind of indifference. He looked at the lens and dared it to find a flaw. This hardness made him a better actor. In 1974, he was cast in a TV movie called The Search for the Gods. It was forgettable trash. But then came The Deadly Tower in 1975. This was the crack in the dam. Kurt was cast as Charles Whitman, the sniper who climbed the University of Texas Tower and gunned down innocent people. It was a role that Walt Disney would have burned the negative of. It was violent, disturbing, and deeply psychological. Kurt didn't play Whitman as a cartoon villain. He played him as a human being, broken, terrifying, and real. He channeled his own frustration, his own anger at the unfairness of life. into the character. The performance was chilling. It was the first time critics looked at Kurt Russell and didn't see the boy who talked to computers. They saw an actor capable of darkness, but the industry wasn't ready to let him out of the box completely. He was still Kurt Russell, the TV guy. He was trapped in the purgatory of the movie of the week. He was working constantly, but he was running in place. He was drifting. He bought a house he couldn't really afford. He got married to Susan Hubley, his co-star in the Elvis movie, and they had a son, Boston. He was going through the motions of adulthood, husband, father, homeowner, but inside he felt like an imposter. He was a ball player in a costume. By 1978, Kurt Russell was contemplating quitting again. Not for baseball this time, but maybe for construction, maybe for carpentry, anything real. He was tired of the falseness. He was tired of the politics. Then the phone rang. It was a casting call for a television biopic. The subject was Elvis Presley. Kurt laughed. The irony was too rich. His first movie role had been kicking Elvis. Now they wanted him to be Elvis. He almost turned it down. Playing Elvis so soon after the King's death was a suicide mission. The fans were rabid. The comparisons would be brutal. If he failed, he would be a laughingstock. If he succeeded, he would just be an impersonator. But then he met the director. John Carpenter was a weirdo. There was no other word for it. He had long hair, a mustache, and he chain-smoked cigarettes like he was trying to create a personal smog bank. He didn't look like a Hollywood director. He looked like a guy who hung out in the back of a comic book store. Carpenter had just made Halloween, a low-budget horror movie that was tearing up the box office. He was the new Prince of Darkness, the antithesis of the Disney system. When Kurt walked into the audition, he didn't give the Disney smile. He walked in with the swagger of a guy who had faced down 90-mile-an-hour fastballs. He walked in with the arrogance of a guy who didn't need the job. Carpenter saw it immediately. He didn't see the wholesome teenager. He saw the sneer. He saw the wounded pride. He saw the exact same tragic quality that Elvis had possessed, the loneliness of the public figure. "You're him," Carpenter said. The filming of Elvis was the moment the tectonic plates of Kurt Russell's life shifted. Kurt didn't just mimic Elvis, he inhabited him. He spent hours in his hotel room, listening to the recordings, not just of the songs, but of Elvis talking. He studied breathing. He studied the way Elvis moved. Not the stage moves, but the way he walked across a room, the way he slumped in a chair when he was tired. He understood Elvis because he was Elvis. He knew what it was like to be owned by a studio. He knew what it was like to be a commodity. He knew what it was like to be a king who was actually a prisoner. There is a scene in the movie where Elvis is alone looking in a mirror and the facade cracks. It is one of the finest pieces of acting in television history. You aren't watching Kurt Russell playing Elvis. You are watching Kurt Russell grieving for his own lost youth, using Elvis as the vessel. When the movie aired, the ratings were monstrous. It beat Gone with the Wind in the television ratings war. The critics were stunned. The Disney boy had disappeared, and in his place was a powerhouse performer with sexuality, danger, and gravity. He was nominated for an Emmy. Suddenly the phone wasn't just ringing, it was ringing off the hook. But this success presented a new trap. Hollywood saw Elvis and said, okay, he's a leading man. Let's put him in romances. Let's put him in dramas. They wanted to polish him up again. They wanted to make him the new Robert Redford. Kurt looked at the offers. He looked at the scripts for soft-focus love stories and safe, crowd-pleasing adventures. He remembered the feeling of the dirt in El Paso. He remembered the sound of the booing crowd in Bend. He remembered the pain in his shoulder. He didn't want to be safe. Safe had gotten him nowhere. Safe had made him a product. He looked at John Carpenter. Carpenter was preparing his next film. It wasn't a biopic. It wasn't a drama. It was a dystopian nightmare, set in a future where New York City had been turned into a maximum security prison. The script was titled Escape from New York. The lead character was named Snake Plissken. The studio wanted a tough guy. They wanted Charles Bronson. They wanted Tommy Lee Jones. They looked at Kurt Russell, the guy with the dimple, the guy who just played Elvis, and they laughed. Kurt Russell, the kid from the cereal box, he can't play Snake Plissken. Kurt heard the laughter. It sounded exactly like the hecklers in the minor leagues. He went to Carpenter. "I want it," he said. "They don't think you can do it," Carpenter replied, lighting another cigarette. "Good," Kurt said. "Let them watch." He began to construct the anti-Disney. If the Disney boy was clean-shaven, Snake would have permanent stubble. If the Disney boy had bright, open eyes, Snake would have one eye covered by a patch. If the Disney boy spoke in a clear, eager tenor, Snake would speak in a raspy, Clint Eastwood-inspired whisper, as if his vocal cords had been scarred by smoke and screaming. He worked out. He transformed his body from the soft athleticism of a baseball player into the lean, ropey muscle of a convict. He wanted a tattoo, a giant cobra rising from his crotch. The studio balked. They were terrified. They were about to put millions of dollars behind a movie where the hero looked like a villain. "That's the point," Kurt argued. "He is a villain. He's just the villain you need right now." The filming of Escape from New York in 1980 was a grueling nocturnal affair. They shot in St. Louis in a neighborhood that had been destroyed by a massive fire, doubling for the ruins of Manhattan. It was cold. It was dirty. It was dangerous. Kurt was in heaven. Walking through the rubble carrying a machine gun, wearing the eye patch that cut off half his peripheral vision, he finally felt the ghost let go. Walt Disney would never have stepped foot on this set. Walt Disney would have been horrified by Snake Plissken. And that was the liberation. When Escape from New York hit theaters in 1981, the audience reaction was a mixture of shock and delight. The first time Snake Plissken walked on screen, the theater went quiet. Who was this? Then he spoke. "Call me Snake." The all-American boy was dead. He had been murdered in broad daylight by a one-eyed outlaw. Kurt Russell had successfully destroyed his own brand. He had taken the lovable image that had been carefully cultivated for 15 years and set it on fire. He proved that he wasn't just an actor. He was a chameleon. He was a survivor. But destruction is easy. Creation is hard. And survival in Hollywood is a game of diminishing returns. Kurt had reinvented himself, yes. He had proven he could be dark. But he was about to learn that darkness has a price. He had aligned himself with John Carpenter, the outsider. Together they had won a battle, but they were about to march into a war that would nearly destroy them both. They were about to head to the Antarctic. They were about to make a movie that would be hated, reviled, and spat upon by the very industry they were trying to conquer. Kurt Russell thought he had faced the worst of it when his shoulder snapped in 1973. He was wrong. The true test of his endurance wasn't physical pain. It was professional annihilation. He was about to meet the thing. The wind cut through the parka like a razor, carrying with it the bite of a Canadian glacier that didn't care about production schedules or union breaks. They were shooting the thing in British Columbia, just a few miles from the Alaskan border. It was 1981, and Kurt Russell was freezing to death for the sake of art. He stood in the snow, a sombrero pulled low over his eyes, a bottle of J&B whiskey in his hand. He looked less like a movie star and more like a man at the end of his rope. The character he was playing, R.J. McCready, was a helicopter pilot with a bad attitude and a worse drinking problem. McCready wasn't a hero. He wasn't Snake Plissken, the confident anarchist who could catch a throwing star in midair. MacReady was tired. He was paranoid. He was a man who wanted to be left alone, trapped in a situation where isolation meant death. Kurt didn't have to dig deep to find that exhaustion. The physical conditions of the shoot were brutal. When they weren't on the glacier, they were on a soundstage in Los Angeles that had been refrigerated to 40 degrees below zero to ensure the actor's breath would fog. For months, Kurt lived in a perpetual state of thermal shock, stepping from the blazing California heat into a meat locker, then back out again. His body ached. The metal plate in his shoulder, a souvenir from his baseball days, throbbed with every drop in barometric pressure. But the internal cold was worse. Kurt and John Carpenter were attempting something dangerous. They weren't just making a monster movie, they were making a film about the total collapse of trust. In the story, an alien organism can imitate any living thing perfectly. The dog, the coworker, the friend, anyone could be the enemy. As Kurt looked around the set at the other actors, Wilford Brimley, Keith David, Donald Moffat, he felt the weight of the metaphor. This was Hollywood. This was the life he had been born into. A world of perfect imitations. A world where the smiling executive could be a predator, where the friendly contract negotiation could be a death sentence. The alien in the thing wasn't a fantastical creature to Kurt. It was the industry incarnate. It absorbed you, digested you, and then wore your face to sell tickets. He poured his cynicism into MacReady. He chose not to make him likable. He made him abrasive, selfish, and competent only because he had to be. When MacReady pours a drink into the computer chess game that beats him, it was Kurt Russell flipping the board on the game he had been forced to play since he was 15. Amidst the grueling marathon of slime and practical effects, Kurt watched the dailies. He saw the tension. He saw the masterful lighting by Dean Cundy. It was grotesque. It was visceral. And it was brilliant. He turned to Carpenter and said, "We're making a classic. This is going to change everything." He truly believed it. He thought the audience would see the bravery of the filmmaking. He thought they would appreciate the dark, uncompromising vision. He thought he had finally shed the Disney skin completely and would be embraced as a serious actor capable of anchoring a heavy, psychological thriller. He didn't check the weather forecast for the American soul. The Thing opened on June 25, 1982. The timing was catastrophic. Just 2 weeks earlier, Steven Spielberg had released E.T. the Extraterrestrial. America in 1982 didn't want a monster. They wanted a hug. The public fell in love with a gentle alien who just wanted to phone home. Then came Kurt Russell with a flamethrower. The contrast was fatal. While audiences wept for E.T., they recoiled from The Thing. Critics didn't just dislike it. They were offended by it. They called it instant junk and pornography for the depressed. Kurt wasn't just the star of a flop. He was the face of a movie that America actively hated. Kurt Russell sat in his living room reading the reviews and felt the floor drop out. They weren't attacking the pacing. They weren't attacking the lighting. They were attacking the nihilism. And because Kurt was the face of that nihilism, they were attacking him. The industry looked at the box office receipts. E.T. was breaking records while The Thing was dying on the vine, and drew a swift, brutal conclusion. Kurt Russell was toxic. He had gone too dark. He had bitten the hand that fed him. The audience had loved him as the smiling boy in tennis shoes. They had tolerated him as the Elvis impersonator. They had been intrigued by him as Snake Plissken. But this bearded, drunk, paranoid survivalist burning dogs with a flamethrower, this was a betrayal of the unwritten contract. The phone stopped ringing. The scripts that had been piling up on his desk after escape from New York vanished. The studio heads who had briefly courted him as the next action star suddenly had full schedules. He was 31 years old. He had just delivered what he considered the best performance of his life, and the world had spit it back in his face. The rejection triggered a deep, resonating hum of insecurity that dated back to the baseball injury. It was the same pattern. Work hard, commit fully, sacrifice your body, and get destroyed by forces outside your control. He contemplated walking away for good this time. The pain was too deep for a simple career change. He didn't look for a trade, he looked for an escape. He bought a boat, entertaining the fantasy of sailing over the horizon and disappearing completely. If Hollywood didn't want him, perhaps the sea wouldn't judge him. But he had a mortgage. He had alimony payments. He had a son, Boston, whom he adored. He couldn't just walk away. He was a Russell. Russell's work. So he went back to the audition circuit. But he went with a chip on his shoulder the size of an iceberg. In 1983, he was called in to read for a romantic drama called Swing Shift. The film was a period piece set during World War II, about the women who worked in the factories while the men were at war. It was a prestige project, a serious movie. The star and producer of the film was Goldie Hawn. If Kurt Russell was the dark prince of the B-movie, Goldie Hawn was the queen of the sunlight. She was America's sweetheart, the giggling, bubbly blonde from Laugh-In who had won an Oscar for Cactus Flower. She was everything the Disney executives had wanted Kurt to be. Universally adored, non-threatening, and commercially golden. Kurt walked into the audition room. He was hungover. He was tired. He hadn't shaved in a few days. He saw Goldie Hawn sitting there, radiating charisma and professional power. He should have been intimidated. He should have been polite. Instead, he looked at her and with the reckless honesty of a man who has nothing left to lose said, "Man, you've got a great figure." It was a terrible line. It was crude. It should have gotten him kicked out of the room. But Goldie didn't kick him out. She laughed. She saw something in his eyes that the critics of the thing had missed. She saw the fatigue. She saw the lack of pretense. In a town full of men who were desperate to impress her, desperate to leverage her fame for their own careers, here was a guy who clearly didn't give a damn. He got the part. The filming of Swing Shift was a chaotic mess of rewrites and director conflicts, but for Kurt, the set became a sanctuary. He wasn't falling in love with a movie star. He was falling in love with a fellow veteran. Goldie Hawn wasn't the ditz she played on TV. She was a shrewd, intelligent producer who had fought her own battles against a sexist industry that wanted to keep her in a box. She understood the cage. She understood the pressure of the smile. They found in each other a shared language of survival. They were both child stars who had grown up in the public eye. They both had failed marriages behind them. They both had children they were trying to protect from the spotlight. Externally, they were opposites. Goldie was the socialite, the life of the party, the woman who could charm a roomful of donors in 5 minutes. Kurt was the recluse, the guy who wanted to watch hunting shows and fix his car. But internally, the polarity reversed. Goldie carried a deep, anxious need for stability beneath her bubbly exterior. Kurt, beneath his gruff shell, possessed a profound, steadying calm, the calm of a catcher behind the plate, managing the game. He grounded her. She lightened him. When the news broke that they were a couple, the tabloids went into a frenzy. It was the Beauty and the Beast narrative. The golden girl and the scruffy rebel. The magazines placed bets on how long it would last. 6 months? A year? Then came the question that would follow them for the next 4 decades. When is the wedding? In Hollywood, a wedding is a branding event. It is a merger. You sell the photo rights to People magazine. You have the ceremony in Malibu. You renew your vows on a reality show. Then 3 years later, you have a messy public divorce where the lawyers fight over the pool furniture. Kurt looked at Goldie. Goldie looked at Kurt. They both looked at the wreckage of their past relationships. They looked at the contracts they had signed with studios, with ex-spouses, that had turned their emotions into legal tender. Kurt hated contracts. A contract had stolen his childhood. A contract had forced him to be a smiling puppet. A contract was a piece of paper that told you what you were allowed to feel and when you were allowed to leave. "I don't want to own you," Kurt told her, "and I don't want to be owned." They made a decision that was more radical than any role Kurt had ever played. They decided not to marry. They decided that they would wake up every morning and choose to be together, not because a piece of paper said they had to, but because they wanted to. If the door's locked, staying inside is a prison sentence. If the door is wide open, staying inside is a home. They built a fortress, not of stone, but of privacy. They moved the family away from the epicenter of Hollywood. They bought a ranch. They created a world where Kurt and Goldie weren't movie stars. They were just Ma and Pa. But the true test of Kurt's character wasn't his relationship with Goldie. It was his relationship with her children. Goldie had 2 kids from her marriage to musician Bill Hudson, Oliver and Kate. They were toddlers when Kurt entered the picture. Their biological father was largely absent, caught up in his own life and career. This is a common tragedy in Hollywood. The children of stars are often treated as accessories, dragged to premieres, and then handed off to nannies. Step-parents come and go like seasonal trends. Kurt Russell looked at these 2 little kids. He saw the confusion in their eyes. He recognized the look of children who were being shaped by forces they couldn't control. He didn't try to be their friend. He didn't try to be the cool stepdad who let them stay up late. He did something much harder. He decided to be a father. He instituted discipline. He made them do chores. He taught them how to throw a baseball. He showed up to the school plays, not to sign autographs, but to sit in the folding chair and clap. There is a story Kate Hudson tells. She was playing soccer as a little girl. She was on the sidelines looking for her parents. Her biological father wasn't there, but there was Kurt, standing on the grass, watching her with the intensity of a scout. He wasn't acting. There were no cameras. This wasn't a scene for a movie about a heartwarming redemption. This was the grind of parenthood. In raising these children, Kurt began to heal the wound of his own stolen childhood. He couldn't go back and save the 15-year-old boy who had to answer to Walt Disney. But he could save these kids from the vacuum of celebrity. He could give them the one thing he had fought so hard to find for himself: reality. He coached Oliver's Little League team. The other parents would stare. There was Snake Plissken, wearing a baseball cap, arguing with the umpire about the strike zone. But he wasn't arguing for the drama. He was arguing because he respected the game. He respected the rules. Baseball, the sport that had broken his heart, became the glue of his new family. It was the place where he taught them that effort mattered more than talent. "It doesn't matter if you're Goldie Hawn's kid," he would tell them. "If you don't catch the ball, you're out." But while his personal life was finding a new, sturdy equilibrium, his career was still listing in choppy waters. Swing Shift bombed. The critics were unkind, and the production drama overshadowed the film. Kurt was now coming off back-to-back failures with The Thing and Swing Shift. The box office poison label was beginning to stick with adhesive permanence. He needed a hit. He needed to remind the industry why they had hired him in the first place. He took a role in a movie called The Mean Season. It was a thriller. It came and went without making a sound. He was drifting again. The mid-'80s were a time of high-concept blockbusters. Stallone and Schwarzenegger were blowing things up and earning millions. They were hard bodies, indestructible machines. Kurt didn't fit that mold. He was too human. He bruised too easily. His characters had too much doubt in their eyes. He needed a project that could harness his specific energy, that strange cocktail of leading man looks and character actor soul. He needed something that allowed him to be funny, tough, and pathetic all at the same time. He called John Carpenter. "What do you have?" Kurt asked. Carpenter laughed. "I have a kung fu movie, but it's not really a kung fu movie." He sent Kurt the script for Big Trouble in Little China. Kurt read it. The character was Jack Burton. On the surface, Jack Burton looked like the hero. He was a truck driver. He wore a tank top. He carried a knife. He talked like John Wayne. But as Kurt turned the pages, he started to smile. He realized the joke. Jack Burton wasn't the hero. Jack Burton was the sidekick who thought he was the hero. He was an idiot. He was a blowhard. He spent half the movie knocked unconscious or asking stupid questions. The real hero was Wang Chi, the Chinese character. It was a subversion of everything Hollywood stood for. It was a deconstruction of the American action hero. Kurt loved it. It was the perfect way to give the middle finger to the industry that demanded he be a stoic, invincible warrior. He would play the leading man as a buffoon. "I'm in," Kurt said. He didn't know it yet, but he was signing up for another disaster. He was signing up for a movie that would confuse the studio, baffle the audience, and put the final nail in the coffin of his days as a traditional star. But he also didn't care. He had Goldie, he had the kids, he had the ranch. The fortress was built. Let the industry burn. He had his own fire to keep him warm. Yet the fire of ambition never truly goes out. It just smolders. And deep down, beneath the layers of contentment and cynicism, the competitive athlete in Kurt Russell still wanted to win. He still wanted to hit the home run. He just didn't know that to do it, he would have to step out from in front of the camera and into the shadows of the director's chair in a town called Tombstone. The release of Big Trouble in Little China in the summer of 1986 was not just a commercial failure. It was a cultural misunderstanding. The audience, fed a steady diet of invincible muscular heroes like Rambo and the Terminator, stared at the screen in confusion. Here was Kurt Russell, their supposed action star, wearing lipstick, missing knife throws, and getting knocked unconscious by falling rocks while the sidekicks did all the fighting. They didn't get the joke. They didn't see the subversive brilliance of deconstructing the white savior trope. They just saw a flop. The studio buried it. The marketing department, baffled by a kung fu ghost story that played like a screwball comedy, threw up their hands. The film vanished from theaters in weeks, leaving Kurt standing in the wreckage of yet another cult classic that wouldn't pay the bills. He was 35 years old. The industry had placed him in a box labeled unbankable. He was the guy you hired if Harrison Ford passed, if Mel Gibson was too expensive, and if you didn't mind the critics scratching their heads. He retreated to the ranch. He drove tractors. He watched his kids play baseball. Externally, he projected the image of the relaxed, unbothered family man. Internally, the competitor in him was pacing the cage. He knew he was better than the scripts he was being sent. He knew he had range that the Stallones and Schwarzeneggers couldn't touch. But Hollywood is a high school cafeteria, and Kurt was sitting at the table by the bathroom. He needed to pivot. If they didn't want him as the hero, he would be the foil. He took jobs simply for paying overboard alongside Goldie. It was lighthearted, a screwball comedy about amnesia and class differences. The critics rolled their eyes, but the audience showed up. They showed up for Goldie, and they stayed for the chemistry. For Kurt, it was easy work. It was playing house with his wife on a boat, but it kept his name on the marquee. Then came the chaotic prelude to his greatest battle. He signed on for Tango and Cash. It was a production disaster, a chaotic mess of fired directors and massive egos. For Kurt, it wasn't art, it was boot camp. Watching millions of dollars burn due to incompetence, he learned a vital lesson that would save his career 4 years later. Sometimes the actor has to be the captain. By the early 90s, Kurt had stabilized his career with Backdraft. Ron Howard's firefighter epic was a massive hit. It was the perfect vehicle for Kurt. Physically demanding, blue-collar, heroic but flawed. The fire was real. The danger was real. Audiences remembered why. They liked him. He looked good covered in soot. But Kurt wanted more than just good. He wanted great. He was looking for his Lawrence of Arabia, his Godfather. He was looking for the project that would define him not as a Disney kid, not as an action star, but as an American icon. He found it in a script written by Kevin Jarre. It was titled Tombstone. The script was a revelation. It wasn't a standard shoot-'em-up. It was a sprawling operatic tragedy about the Earp brothers and Doc Holliday. It was dialogue that tasted like whiskey and gunpowder. It was about brotherhood, addiction, and the terrible weight of violence. Kurt signed on immediately to play Wyatt Earp. He was the first one in. He helped secure the financing. He helped recruit the cast. He called Val Kilmer. He called Sam Elliott. He called Bill Paxton. He was the glue holding the dream together. Kevin Jarre, the writer, was set to direct. It was his baby. He had a vision of the West that was historically accurate, gritty, and epic. The production moved to Arizona in May 1993. The heat was apocalyptic. The dust coated the back of your throat and stayed there. The actors were squeezed into heavy wool frock coats and starched collars, sweating through layers of period-accurate misery. And almost immediately, the dream turned into a nightmare. Kevin Jarre was a brilliant writer, but he was not a general. Directing a massive Western with horses, wagons, explosions, and 50 speaking roles requires a logistical mind. Jarre was a poet. He fell behind schedule on the very first day. He obsessed over the historical accuracy of a saddle while the sun was setting and the shot was lost. By the end of the first month, the production was weeks behind. The footage was flat. The energy was lethargic. The studio Buena Vista, a division of Disney, sent down the executioners. The executives arrived in black sedans, looking out at the dusty set with the cold calculation of morticians. They told the producer, Jim Jacks, that they were pulling the plug. Tombstone was dead. They were going to write off the losses and go home. Kurt Russell stood in the trailer listening to the death knell of the movie he loved. He looked at the cast. He saw Val Kilmer, who was delivering a performance as Doc Holliday that was nothing short of possessed. He saw Sam Elliott, the soul of the West. He saw the hundreds of crew members who were about to lose their jobs. The Disney boy would have packed his bags and gone home. The Disney boy would have done what he was told. But the man who had survived the minor leagues, the man who had played Snake Plissken, the man who had raised another man's children, he wasn't going to let this die. He walked into the producer's office. He closed the door. "I will fix it," Kurt said. The executives looked at him skeptically. "You're an actor, Kurt." "I will direct it," he said, "but I can't put my name on it." He knew the politics. If he, the star, was named director, the industry would smell blood. They would call it a vanity project. The critics would sharpen their knives. And purely for insurance reasons, the studio wouldn't hand the reins of a $25 million movie to a first-time director in the middle of a crisis. So they hatched a conspiracy, a cover-up in the desert. They fired Kevin Jarre. The cast was heartbroken. They loved Kevin's vision, but they knew the ship was sinking. Kurt told the studio to hire George P. Cosmatos. Cosmatos was a journeyman director, best known for Rambo: First Blood Part 2. He was loud, he was arrogant, and he was known for getting things done on time. But the deal was explicit. Cosmatos was the front, Kurt Russell was the command. Kurt met Cosmatos in a hotel room before the new director stepped on set. He handed him the shot list. He looked him in the eye. "I'm going to give you the shot list every night," Kurt said. "You're going to come to set and you're going to yell action and cut. You're going to boss the extras around. You're going to be the general. But I'm telling you where to put the camera." Cosmatos agreed. He wanted the paycheck. He wanted the credit. And so began the most grueling ordeal of Kurt Russell's life. For 80 days, Kurt Russell ceased to exist as a human being. He became a machine fueled by caffeine and sheer will. By day, he was Wyatt Earp, memorizing lines and riding horses under the blistering Arizona sun. By night, while the rest of the cast slept, he was the shadow director, rewriting scenes, planning camera angles, and managing a crisis that threatened to sink the entire production. He was burning the candle at both ends and in the middle. His eyes behind the steely gaze of the lawman were screaming with exhaustion. This went on for 80 days. It was a physical and mental demolition. Kurt lost weight. His eyes behind the Wyatt Earp steel were rimmed with red. He was holding up the sky. But the hardest part wasn't the work. It was the editing. As the footage came together, Kurt faced a brutal reality. The script was too long and the movie was dragging. If they kept everything, the studio would butcher it. To save the film, he realized his ego had to die. Kurt voluntarily cut his own best scenes, stripping Wyatt Earp of his depth to turn him into the stoic rock that allowed Val Kilmer's Doc Holliday to shine. He didn't just edit the film, he sacrificed his performance to save it. He was the quarterback who decides to never throw the ball, only to hand it off, play after play, because he knows the running back is having the game of his life. When Tombstone wrapped, Kurt collapsed. He had nothing left. He had directed a blockbuster Western in secret, while starring in it, while fighting a studio that wanted it dead. The movie was released in December 1993. It was a smash hit. It made $56 million domestically, a huge number for a Western in the 90s. The audience loved it. It became an instant classic, the kind of movie men quote to each other at barbecues 3 decades later. "I'm your huckleberry. Skin that smoke wagon." The reviews poured in. They hailed Val Kilmer. They called it the performance of his career. They talked about the visual style of George P. Cosmatos. They praised the script and Kurt. The critics said he was solid. They said he was stiff. They said he was overshadowed by Kilmer. They didn't know. They didn't know that the visual style was Kurt's. They didn't know that the pacing was Kurt's. They didn't know that the reason Kilmer was so good was that Kurt had built the entire movie as a pedestal for him to stand on. Kurt read the reviews. He watched the award season come and go. Val Kilmer got the buzz. George Cosmatos gave interviews taking credit for saving the sinking ship. Kurt Russell sat in his home in the Palisades silent. He could have leaked the story. He could have called Variety. He could have demanded his credit. He didn't. He had made a deal. He had given his word. The Disney boy, the one who was taught to be a good soldier, was still in there somewhere. But now he was a soldier who had won the war only to be left off the memorial. There was a bitterness in the victory. He had proven to himself that he could do it. He was a filmmaker. He was a leader. But the world still saw him as just a chin, a head of hair, a product. He had saved the studio millions. He had created a piece of American mythology that would outlive them all. And his reward was anonymity. This experience broke something in him regarding his ambition. He realized that the game was rigged. You could give everything, your blood, your sleep, your ego, and the machine would still only credit the name on the contract. He retreated again. He pulled back from the big budget blockbusters. He didn't want the responsibility anymore. He didn't want to carry the weight. He looked at Goldie. He looked at the kids. He looked at the wine cellar he was building. I'm done saving them, he thought. He spent the rest of the 90s as a mercenary. Blockbusters like Stargate and Executive Decision kept his face on the posters and his bank account full, but the inferno that had fueled The Thing and Tombstone had banked down to glowing embers. He was professional, excellent, but completely hollow. A soldier without a war, waiting for the moment he could finally stop pretending. But the third act of a life often brings a twist that the screenwriter didn't see coming. The Disney boy was about to become the cool dad for a generation of filmmakers who grew up worshiping the very movies the critics had hated. Kurt Russell wasn't done. He was just fermenting. The late 1990s and early 2000s were a strange twilight for Kurt Russell. To the casual observer, he was a fixture of Hollywood, a reliable square-jawed star who could anchor an action movie or carry a drama. He was rich. He was famous. He was half of one of the most enduring power couples in entertainment history. But internally, he had checked out. The ordeal of Tombstone had left a scar tissue that hardened over his ambition. He had seen behind the curtain. He had seen how the sausage was made, and he had seen that even when you make the sausage perfectly, the butcher takes the credit. He stopped fighting for the great roles. He stopped trying to direct from the shadows. He became exactly what his father, Bing Russell, had been: a working actor, a tradesman. He took roles that allowed him to be home for dinner. He took roles that paid for his passion projects, making wine, flying planes, and watching his children grow up. He was present for Kate and Oliver's careers taking off, offering advice not as a star, but as a survivor of the same minefield they were now walking through. He watched as the industry changed. The era of the mid-budget movie, the thrillers, the westerns, the adult dramas that had been his bread and butter, was dying, replaced by the age of the superhero and the mega franchise. The world was moving on. And then something unexpected happened. The generation of kids who had been traumatized by The Thing and exhilarated by Escape from New York grew up, and they picked up cameras. Quentin Tarantino, Robert Rodriguez, James Gunn. These weren't directors who worshipped Citizen Kane. They worshipped Snake Plissken. They worshipped Jack Burton. To them, Kurt Russell wasn't a failed Disney star or box office poison. He was cool incarnate. He was the rugged, cynical, anti-authoritarian uncle they wished they had. In 2007, the phone rang. It was Quentin Tarantino. Tarantino didn't want the Disney boy. He didn't want the polite leading man. He wanted the monster. He wanted Kurt to play stuntman Mike in Death Proof, a psychopathic killer who murders women with his death-proof car. Kurt read the script. It was violent. It was nasty. It was dialogue-heavy trash poetry. It was the furthest thing from Walt Disney imaginable. He said yes. Filming Death Proof was a resurrection. Tarantino treated Kurt not as an employee, but as an icon. He let Kurt eat nachos on screen with a feral intensity. He let him be charming, terrifying, and ultimately a pathetic coward. When the movie came out, it wasn't a massive hit, but it signaled a shift. The critics who had sneered at him in the 80s were now writing essays about his legendary charisma. The cult of Kurt was going mainstream. He was entering his Lion in Winter phase. The gray hair suited him. The lines on his face, etched by decades of fake smiles and real stress, gave him a gravitas that couldn't be faked with makeup. He began to pop up in franchises, but always on his terms. In Fast and Furious 7, he played Mr. Nobody, a government spook who wears a suit and smiles while the world burns. It was a meta-commentary on his own career. The man who knows where the bodies are buried because he helped dig the graves. Then came The Hateful Eight, another Tarantino joint, Kurt played John the Hangman Ruth. He spent the movie chained to Jennifer Jason Leigh, punching her in the face, drinking coffee, and spitting dialogue with a John Wayne cadence so thick you could chew it. He was having fun again. You could see it in his eyes. The deadness of the 70s, the exhaustion of the 90s. It was gone. He was playing. But the ultimate vindication came in 2017 with Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Marvel Studios, the new Disney, called him. They wanted him to play a character named Ego, the living planet. The symbolism was almost too heavy to bear. Kurt Russell, the man who had spent 50 years trying to escape the orbit of the Disney moon, was now playing a literal planet, a god, a father figure who seems benevolent and charming on the surface, but who actually wants to consume his son to expand his own power. It was the story of his life inverted. In the 60s, he was the son being consumed by the father. Now he was the father trying to consume the son. Kurt played the role with a terrifying charm. He used the Disney smile, that same bright, dimpled grin from the computer wore tennis shoes, but now weaponized. He showed the world the darkness that lies behind the perfect facade of the all-American dad. When Ego reveals his true nature, when the smile drops and the monster appears, it was Kurt Russell finally exorcising the ghost of Walt Disney on the biggest screen in the world. He was saying, "This is what you wanted me to be? A perfect, smiling God? Fine. Look at how ugly it really is." The film was a massive success. A new generation of kids bought Kurt Russell action figures, but this time, he wasn't a prisoner of the merchandise. He was in on the joke. As he moved into his 70s, Kurt Russell settled into a role he had been rehearsing for decades, the patriarch, but not the patriarchal figure Hollywood wanted him to be, the stern, moralizing father. He was the cool, slightly dangerous patriarch, the one who drinks wine, flies planes, and tells you the truth even if it hurts. His relationship with Goldie remained the bedrock. They became grandparents. They spent their days at the ranch in Colorado or the vineyard in California. They were photographed walking down the street, holding hands, laughing at jokes only they understood. The tabloids finally stopped asking when they were going to get married. The question had become irrelevant. They had outlasted the marriages of everyone who had criticized them. They had proven that a contract is nothing compared to a choice. Later in life, he even ventured into winemaking. He created Go Jai wines, diving into the science of winemaking with the same obsessive detail he once applied to baseball. It wasn't a celebrity hobby. It was a craft. It was proof that he had finally built a life real enough to touch, taste, and cork. It was the story of his career in a bottle. Looking back at the landscape of his life from the vantage point of 2024, the irony is staggering. The Disney boy is gone. The studio system that created him has mutated into a content algorithm. The Burbank lot where he was held prisoner is now just a small part of a global entertainment hegemony. But Kurt Russell remains. He is the last of a specific breed of movie star, the blue-collar star, the guy who learned his craft, not in drama school but on the job, the guy who treated fame not as a religion, but as a hazard pay. His filmography is a map of American cinema over the last 60 years. He was there for the end of the studio system. He was there for the rise of the TV movie. He was there for the birth of the blockbuster. He was there for the indie revolution. He was there for the superhero dominance. He survived it all, and he did it by refusing to be what they wanted him to be. The deathbed note that Walt Disney wrote in 1966 was supposed to be a script for Kurt's life. Walt wanted a sequel to his own legacy. He wanted a clean, wholesome, smiling avatar to carry the torch of American innocence. But Kurt Russell realized early on that innocence is a lie. You can't be innocent in a world that breaks your shoulder. You can't be innocent in a world that eats its young. So he chose experience. He chose scars. He chose the messy, complicated, painful reality of being human. He didn't inherit the kingdom. He built his own out of wood and wine and stubbornness on the outskirts of town, where the rules of the mouse don't apply. And somewhere in the quiet of his vineyard, pouring a glass of wine as the sun sets over the Santa Rita hills, the man with the dimpled chin finally smiles. It is not the smile of a product, not the smile of a prisoner. It is the smile of a man who realized that the death note from 1966 wasn't a gift. It was a curse. And he spent 50 years turning that curse into a declaration of independence. Walt Disney was wrong. Kurt Russell wasn't the future of the Magic Kingdom. He was the antidote. He is not the son of a ghost. He is his own man. And that Wadi is the only role he ever truly wanted to play.